Ashring is built around Chapter 10's enemies and mechanics, so spoiler warnings ahead. I'll initially cover my thoughts on the map design as well as why I think this is one of the best CCs we've had yet, as well as how Hypergrowth managed to ruin all of it with such a disappointing week 2. To this end, the permanent map in week 1 has a maximum risk of 30 and is rather reminiscent of CC5's top-down triple lane design paradigm. However, the main difference is that this CC heavily focuses on the right side, with Manfred, the boss, as well as other relevant enemies spawning there for the most part. Before talking about the map itself though, we need to look at the enemies, as for the most part I do not believe my audience has played Chapter 10. This slug here makes up around half of the stage's enemies, with its unique quirk being that although it has low defense, resistance and health, it has a 90% reduction against all physical and arts damage, and when being blocked, gives the ally blocking it +1 block up to a maximum of 6. In practice, this means that hordes of them can be stored even by a 1 block unit, and they also increase the multi-target hit count of AoE cards such as Blaze. The next type of enemy, although it might look intimidating, is actually exactly like the slugs, just boasting slightly higher overall stats. For more interesting enemies, we have this stereotypical Bruiser Elite enemy that increases its attack for every supposedly reborn figure on field, which means the slugs and the previous enemy which I mentioned. In addition, upon death, it spawns a copy of the big slug in its place. Another interesting enemy is the Charger, which channels to charge the city cannon, which is something I'll talk about later. If he is interrupted during the channel, the city cannon loses a portion of its charge, and upon death, it spawns a mini slug in its place. As for the last regular enemy, we have a drone, which is by default invisible, and will gradually lose life over time. When attacking enemies in its small range, it will charge the city cannon. Before moving on to talk about Manfred, the main boss, I'll elaborate a bit on what the city cannon does. Essentially, over time or with the abilities of other units, the city cannon will charge, and the progress is displayed as a bar on the top of the screen. Upon reaching max charge, it looks for the allied unit with the highest block count, and in the event of a tie, looks for the unit that was deployed the most recently, striking them with 3000 true damage in this range shown on screen. It's an essential part of Chapter 10, and in the context of this CC, it is mainly beneficial for us given that a lot of the enemies are very susceptible to true damage. I really don't have time to evaluate Manfred in detail, but suffice to say that he has 2 phases, he has very little immunities, i.e. he is not immune to stun or sleep, and he has ramping damage when hitting the same target. Passively, he has 80% physical and arts dodge, but is deactivated for 30 seconds upon being hit by the cannon, and he also self-stuns for 8 seconds. In his first form, every attack charges the cannon by a small amount, and when he dies and rebirths for the first time, during his rebirth cycle of 20 seconds, he summons a drone that sporadically attacks allied units on the field, dealing arts damage and also charging the cannon. In his second form, his damage is more or less doubled, and similarly, the amount of charge he gives to the cannon is also doubled. Objectively speaking, looking at the minimum requirements to clear each risk level, CC10 Ashring is the easiest by a pretty significant margin. But that's not to say that it's a bad CC. Looking at CC7, most players generally considered it repetitive because all you had to do was to stack your DPS units in the center, get a feel of the yin-yang mechanics which many people found very gimmicky, and together with chowder abuse, the stage is a breeze. Ashring on the other hand provides a variety of factors for you to consider, be it the slugs on the left side, the bondage caster, the consistent stream of slugs in the middle, the dangerous invisible melee enemies, Manfred, the threatening boss, as well as, most importantly, the charging of the cannon. For the most part, CC10 is notably different from CC6, 7, 8, and 9 in the sense that with the cannon, you're mostly forced to play dynamically, having to rotate your operators to an extent that generally wasn't seen in the previous CCs. For example, in CC6, you basically had Chowder and Ash in one placement throughout the map. CC7 essentially had the same thing with camping the middle. Most CC8 strategies only camped the right side near the blue box, however there were a few interesting kill strategies that staircased up to the archers. While CC9 was incredibly fun around the middle parts of the map as well as in middle risks, the nature of risk scaling in CCs meant that towards the end you basically just had to stall everything, and it became not a very fun experience. For this CC in particular, the gimmick was true damage, but a great portion of week 1 was done without the abuse of extensive true damage, given that players weren't actually optimizing it that well yet. This made for fun gameplay loops where you were managing the cannon's charge, managing block counts of your units, along with unique interactions with the enemies that buff your block count. Towards the later half of week 1, however, many players decided to optimize the runs, and they quickly discovered that abusing the cannon and abusing true damage made the map incredibly trivial to the point where it was almost as easy as CC7 if not easier. This was given how the entire left side is trivialized by the cannon solo, with only the bondage caster being a threat, and nearly the entire right side also being able to be trivialized by the cannon due to the lack of threatening enemies and the mass flow of enemies that were susceptible to true damage. Furthermore, although the boss, Manfred, looked very threatening on paper, infinitely stalling him was actually possible and just whittling him down with the continuous cannon charges. In a more high-risk context, the true damage offered by Neo's Radiant Knight's skill 3 and Kautsted's skill 3 made the map almost a joke given that they one-shot a ton of enemies and could easily shred Manfred. In addition, NTRK having block 1 and Kautsted having block 3 made them optimal choices for block management. To this end, a lot of players decided that week 1 was pretty easy and they had high hopes for week 2 given the variety of map mechanics they could buff, the lack of say a health risk, especially with more mechanics regarding the cannon, the more unique enemies, as well as how to move true damage away from trivializing the entire map. If done correctly, a lot of players theorized that this could be one of the most interesting and fun CCs that Hypergrowth has made to date. Before talking about week 2 though, I have to stress again on the importance of cannon in the player's favor. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to claim that the majority of damage dealt to non-boss enemies in this map was through the cannon, and without it, the CC would probably be one of the hardest to date. Although I initially stated that managing the cannon's charge was a very fun and interesting mechanic, it slowly grew repetitive due to how blatantly strong it was being able to one-shot say the starting enemies without any external help. It's also important to note that increasing the damage of the cannon is a purely beneficial thing in the player's favor, given that no unit except say Gavil Altar can actually tank the cannon, especially with the HP reduction risk. Now then, with the foreshadowing in place, what did Hypergrowth do for week 2? Well, they added a total of 8 risks, and combined you can bring your total risk score to 36. This was a pretty big disappointment given that CC9 Deepness had a max risk of 39. Well, that wouldn't really matter if the risks were good and actually introduced a new level of difficulty for the map, right? Well, read the video title. For starters, the only thing affecting the cannon was a risk that increased its damage by 1000. This was the first time, outside of very specific CC6 Sandstorm strategies, that had a risk which entirely buffed your clear. In week 1, the 4 enemies AFKing at the start, which many used Silverish to deal with, only had around 80% of their health taken away by the cannon, while in week 2 with the increased damage, they just get one shot. Sounds pretty bad, right? But well, that would be all solved if they added at health risk, because health is the most effective mitigating factor against true damage. Guess what? No HP risks was seen. I'll just list out the other risks and then I'll comment later about why I find them disappointing. For starters, we have 2 choices for Manfred R3, which really don't do something that drastically different from R2, except just amplifying a few stats. Then we have DP down 3, which is rather expected, but as I'll elaborate on later, this wasn't an issue. Then we have squad size 2, which is weird considering that week 1 already had deploy limit 2, and it's almost always easier to choose deploy limit 2 having 5 deployment slots over 7 squad slots. Then they added a risk for additional enemies, which was an okay risk honestly. There's also a risk for 200 defense, and then the Tau ban risk banning 3 Taus on the left side. To begin, the risks on Manfred have very little effect given that they're just incremental stat buffs, and although the health buffs look very fancy on paper, Manfred is actually heavily debuffed from his base form in this CC, so it really just brings him back to what he should be. Furthermore, neither of the tier 3 risks actually prevent the infinite stalling of Manfred, as is demonstrated by this clear up on screen now. However, it's still a solid risk, and if the other risks had a similar level of difficulty to this, well, maybe it wouldn't be that bad. Next up, we have DP3 reducing natural DP generation by 75%. The kicker of this risk is one of 2 factors. One, Kautset being a thing and monster always having a static redeployment cost, which makes it so that redeployment costs don't go into the insane ranges, and 2, Canterbury being a thing, which is a new vanguard of the agent archetype, which allows you to gain DP upon auto attacks. Notably, there's no ASPD down risk, probably for Hypergrowth to showcase her potential. Next being squad size, which I talked about briefly earlier. In its own, it's not an inherently bad risk, but it's usually reserved for week 1 in the past CCs to test on how far week 1 can go. Adding it with such a weak week 2 feels a bit odd, especially given that since it's significantly harder than deploy limit, they probably could have pushed it to R3 and made the total risk of the CC go up to 37. The more enemies risk is honestly fine, it creates a bit more of a threat on the left side, and it was honestly pretty funny watching a few friends of mine forget that the risk existed before failing the run entirely. Unfortunately though, due to the tempo of the map, those enemies can easily be trivialized by say Kautsted's skill 3 without impacting the general flow of what else is going on. Finally, the last relevant risk is the left side Tau ban, which bans the popular Mudrock Tau used a lot in week 1. However, this doesn't actually make the left side a lot harder because the options for NTRK and Surtur placements are still readily available to decimate the left side mobs combined with the additionally buffed cannon. For the actual last risk, it actually isn't relevant at all, even though it seems very scary. Due to the nature of having attack down 3 in week 1, physical operators were already irrelevant, so this is more just kicking a dead horse. In the higher risks of week 1, physical operators are barely used, and in week 2 max, physical operators are basically seen nowhere. Essentially, this is a free risk for those attempting to go for the higher scores. All this combined makes week 2 max very similar to week 1 max, already at a state where week 1 max was pretty trivial. The outcome of this was almost identical to CC7, where max risk was cleared within hours, and then people started experimenting with pushing the limits of low operator, along with other aspirational challenges such as E2 level 1 or class knights. In totality, max risk got down to 6 operators, which is probably the lowest we'll ever see for a risk this high, and it enshrines CC10 Ashring's week 2 as one of the more disappointing week 2s we've had so far. There was so much dynamic potential in the map, but the abuse of the raw power from true damage as well as the city cannon made the CC a breeze, and Hypergrowth should definitely have noticed this in their week 1 and reactively fixed it, as opposed to exacerbating the issue and making week 2 trivial. Thanks for watching this video, and any queries about the potential points I brought up as well as my personal feelings on CC10 can be left in the comments, and I'll try to respond within a few hours. With that, the banner releasing in EN in a few days will be Fiammetta, and I wish all of you the best of luck when pulling for her. Have a great day.